The search for the perfect wedding venue had been exhausting. After visiting 15 different places over 3 months, Amy and David were starting to lose hope. Each location either felt too stuffy, too modern, or came with owners who seemed to subtly discourage them with raised prices or suddenly unavailable dates when they saw the couple in person. As an interracial couple, they'd grown used to reading between the lines. The forced smiles, the slight hesitations, the way some venue managers would immediately start discussing their premium packages with astronomical prices. They'd seen it all, but they refused to let it dim their excitement about their special day. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, while driving home from yet another disappointing venue visit, David took a wrong turn. That's when they saw it. Mason Grove, a gorgeous Victorian mansion with white columns and a wraparound porch that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. The property's iron gates were open, and a simple "Tours Welcome" sign swayed gently in the breeze. "Should we?" Amy asked, her eyes lighting up for the first time in weeks. "Why not? We're already here," David smiled, turning into the cobblestone driveway. The mansion's garden was a masterpiece of organized chaos. Roses climbed ancient trellises, and a stone pathway wound through beds of wildflowers. Despite the gloomy weather, the place felt alive with possibility. The couple stood hand in hand, already imagining their guests mingling on the lawn. A soft tap on a window drew their attention. An elderly woman in a cardigan waved at them from inside, then appeared at the front door moments later. Mrs. Thompson, as she introduced herself, wasn't anything like the polished venue managers they'd met before. She wore gardening gloves and had a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "You two look like you're searching for something special," she said warmly, inviting them inside without hesitation. The interior was even more breathtaking. Hardwood floors that gleamed with age, crown molding that told stories of craftsmanship from another era, and windows that filled every room with natural light. Mrs. Thompson didn't hand them a pricing brochure or start with a rehearsed sales pitch. Instead, she asked them about their story, how they met at a coffee shop when Amy accidentally spilled her latte all over David's new shoes, how they discovered they both volunteered at the same animal shelter but on different days, and how David proposed during a rainstorm because he was too excited to wait for the perfect sunny moment he planned. She showed them every room, sharing little historical tidbits about the house that had been in her family for generations. When they reached the garden sunroom, Mrs. Thompson paused. "You know," she said, looking at them thoughtfully, "this place has hosted love stories for over 100 years. But what makes them special isn't just the setting. It's the hearts of the people celebrating here." The couple exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. This wasn't just another venue. This was where they wanted to begin their forever. When Mrs. Thompson mentioned the price, it was surprisingly reasonable. No hidden fees or sudden premiums. As they filled out the booking forms in Mrs. Thompson's cozy office, surrounded by old photographs of other happy couples who had celebrated there, Amy and David felt a weight lift from their shoulders. They'd found more than just a venue. They'd found an ally who saw them for who they were, two people in love, ready to share their joy with the world. Little did they know that their perfect find would soon become the center of an unexpected storm, one that would test not just their wedding plans, but the very spirit of the community around them. The excitement of finding their perfect wedding venue lasted exactly 3 weeks. That's when the moving trucks pulled up to the house next door to Mason Grove, and Mrs. Wilson arrived with her perfectly manicured nails and permanently pursed lips. She didn't bring welcome cookies or introduce herself to the neighbors like most people would. Instead, she spent her first day putting up security cameras. All of them somehow pointed directly at the mansion's garden. At first, Amy and David didn't think much of it. They were too busy with their wedding plans, meeting with florists and picking out tablecloths in Mrs. Thompson's sunny dining room. But then the whispers started at the monthly neighborhood council meetings. "Property values are at stake here," Mrs. Wilson would say, her voice carrying across the community center. "We need to maintain certain standards." She never directly mentioned Amy and David, but her eyes would narrow every time they drove past her house for their planning meetings. One particularly sunny afternoon, while Amy was discussing flower arrangements with Mrs. Thompson on the front porch, Mrs. Wilson appeared at her fence like a shadow. She had her phone out, not even trying to hide the fact that she was recording them. "Is everything okay?" Mrs. Thompson called out, friendly as ever. "Just documenting the neighborhood activities," Mrs. Wilson replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "For security purposes, of course." The incident left a knot in Amy's stomach. That evening, over dinner with David, she couldn't shake off her unease. "Maybe we should look for another venue," she suggested, pushing her food around her plate. "Hey," David reached across the table, taking her hand. "We're not letting anyone push us around. This is our day, remember?" But Mrs. Wilson was just getting started. She began hosting what she called neighborhood watch meetings in her living room. Through the large windows, Amy and David could see groups of people gathering, though most of the neighbors seemed more uncomfortable than interested in her presentations. The breaking point came during a cake tasting session. Mrs. Wilson marched right up to the mansion's front door, clipboard in hand. "I'm conducting a survey about commercial activity in residential areas," she announced, her pen poised like a weapon. Mrs. Thompson, bless her heart, didn't miss a beat. "How lovely. While you're here, would you like to try some wedding cake? The baker has made the most wonderful lavender and honey flavor." The look on Mrs. Wilson's face was priceless, a mix of surprise and confusion at being met with kindness instead of confrontation. She stammered something about being on a diet and retreated, but not before they caught her taking more photos with her phone. That evening, during the neighborhood's weekly walking group, something unexpected happened. Old Mr. Chen from across the street stopped by Mrs. Wilson's house. He'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and rarely spoke up at meetings, but today he had something to say. "You know," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "my wife and I had our wedding reception at Mason Grove back in 1975. Mrs. Thompson's mother hosted it. Not everyone in town was happy about a Chinese couple getting married in such a historic place." He paused, looking directly at Mrs. Wilson. "But love has a way of changing people's hearts. Sometimes it just takes time." The message was clear, but Mrs. Wilson seemed unmoved. If anything, her determination appeared to grow stronger. As Amy and David left their final cake tasting that evening, they noticed her on her phone again, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. They had no way of knowing that Mrs. Wilson's next move would shake not just their wedding plans, but the entire community to its core. And yet, sometimes the worst actions bring out the best in people, a lesson they were about to learn in the most unexpected way. Nobody expects police officers to show up at their workplace, especially not 2 weeks before their wedding day. For Amy, it happened during her afternoon rounds at the children's hospital. She was just finishing up with a young patient when a nurse quietly pulled her aside, saying 2 officers were waiting to speak with her at the front desk. Her first thought was that something had happened to David. Her heart pounding, she rushed to the lobby, only to find herself facing questions about something completely different. The officers looked uncomfortable as they explained why they were there. "We've received multiple reports of suspicious activity around Mason Grove," one officer said, flipping through his notepad. "According to the witness, there have been repeated visits at odd hours, photographs being taken of the security system, and unusual interest in the mansion's layout." Amy almost laughed, thinking it was a joke. But the officers weren't smiling. They had surveillance photos, the same ones Mrs. Wilson had been taking, but somehow they looked different now. The happy moments of wedding planning had been twisted into something sinister. There was David measuring the garden for the tent setup, but the report labeled it as examining entry points. There was Amy taking pictures of the beautiful windows for their wedding photographer, described as documenting security vulnerabilities. "This is ridiculous," Amy said, her voice shaking. "We're getting married there in 2 weeks. We have a contract. Mrs. Thompson knows us." But the damage was already done. The officers explained that they had to investigate any reported security threats. Mrs. Thompson had been forced to temporarily close the property, meaning all events, including their wedding, were on hold until the investigation was complete. The news spread through the hospital like wildfire. Amy's colleagues were outraged. The head nurse, who had been helping Amy plan her wedding flowers, marched right up to the officers and gave them an earful about jumping to conclusions. Even some of Amy's young patient's parents, overhearing what was happening, stepped forward to vouch for her character. Meanwhile, across town, David was dealing with his own shock. His phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from their wedding vendors. The caterer, the photographer, the DJ. Everyone needed to know if they should keep the date or look for other bookings. The wedding they'd spent months planning was unraveling in real time. That evening, they met at their favorite coffee shop, the same one where they'd first met. The place was quiet, with just a few regulars scattered around. The barista, who knew their usual orders by heart, took one look at their faces and brought over 2 hot chocolates on the house. "Maybe we should just elope," Amy whispered, staring into her untouched drink. Her eyes were red from crying, but now she just felt numb. David reached across the table and took her hand. "No way, we're not letting her win. This is our wedding, our day, and we've done nothing wrong." Just then, David's phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Thompson. "Don't worry, dears. The truth has a way of coming out. Just wait and see." They had no idea just how right she would be. As they sat there, planning their next move, security cameras from neighboring businesses were already being checked. Local residents were digging through their own surveillance footage. And most importantly, someone who knew both Amy and David's true identities was about to step forward with information that would turn Mrs. Wilson's whole plan upside down. The next 24 hours would reveal secrets that nobody saw coming, especially not Mrs. Wilson. Sometimes, the people you try to tear down turn out to be the very ones you least expect, and karma has a way of delivering perfect justice. The truth came out in the most unexpected way during an emergency at the local children's hospital. Mrs. Wilson's 6-year-old grandson had been rushed in with a severe allergic reaction, his throat closing up, his tiny body fighting for air. In the chaos of the emergency room, she didn't immediately recognize the doctor who burst through the doors and took charge of the situation. "I need epinephrine, now." The calm, commanding voice belonged to Amy, who was completely focused on saving her young patient. She didn't notice Mrs. Wilson standing there, watching in shock as the woman she'd been trying to drive away worked frantically to save her grandson's life. For 20 tense minutes, Amy worked with her team, her movements precise and confident. Nobody in that room cared about wedding venues or neighborhood disputes. They were all united in their effort to help a child in crisis. When the boy's breathing finally stabilized, the relief in the room was palpable. It was only then, as Amy was explaining the treatment plan, that Mrs. Wilson realized who she was. The doctor everyone treated with such respect, the one who had just saved her grandson's life, was the same person she'd accused of being a criminal. But that wasn't the only revelation of the day. As Mrs. Wilson sat in the hospital waiting room, still processing what had happened, a group of police officers arrived. They weren't there to investigate Amy and David. They were there to check on their colleague's future wife. "How's the little guy doing?" one officer asked Amy. "David's been worried sick since he heard about the call coming in. He's stuck testifying in court, but he wanted us to make sure everything was okay." Mrs. Wilson's face went pale. "David? The David who's getting married at Mason Grove?" "Yeah, Detective David from the downtown precinct," another officer replied. "One of our best. He's probably put away more actual burglars than anyone else in the department." Kind of ironic, isn't it? The officers weren't trying to make Mrs. Wilson feel bad. They didn't even know who she was. They were just proud of their colleague and genuinely concerned about the child. But their words hit harder than any accusation could have. Later that evening, after her grandson had been moved to a regular room, Mrs. Wilson sat watching him sleep. She thought about how close she'd come to losing him, and how the person who saved him was someone she'd been actively trying to hurt. She thought about all the assumptions she'd made, all the energy she'd spent trying to protect her neighborhood from imaginary threats, while the real heroes had been right in front of her all along. Down the hall, Amy was finishing her shift, exhausted but satisfied that her patient would make a full recovery. She had no idea that her actions that day had done more than save a life. They had started to change a heart. The next morning, the police investigation into Mason Grove took an interesting turn. Officers who had worked with David for years came forward, laughing at the idea that he could be involved in any criminal activity. Security footage from neighboring businesses showed nothing but normal wedding planning activities. Even Mrs. Thompson's gardener provided videos of the couple helping to plant new flowers for the ceremony. But the most powerful statement came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Wilson herself walked into the police station, her grandson's medical papers in hand, ready to tell the truth about everything. Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to see people for who they really are, and she had finally seen the truth in the clearest possible way. The revelation wasn't just about Amy and David's professions. It was about the kind of people they were. The kind who would save your family member's life, even after you tried to ruin their wedding. The kind who earned respect not through fear or suspicion, but through their daily actions and dedication to helping others. News travels fast in small communities, but the truth about Mrs. Wilson's false accusations spread like wildfire. It started with a simple post on the neighborhood's online group from Mr. Chen. "Our local heroes need our help." He shared the story of how Amy had saved Mrs. Wilson's grandson, carefully leaving out any private medical details, and how David had been serving the community as a detective all along. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The baker who had been doing their cake tasting posted security footage showing the couple's many happy visits to Mason Grove. "Look at these dangerous criminals," she wrote sarcastically, sharing a clip of Amy and David helping Mrs. Thompson carry boxes of old decorations to donate to a local charity. The daughter of one of Amy's former patients chimed in next. "This is the doctor who spent Christmas Eve reading stories to my little sister when she was in the hospital," she wrote, sharing a photo of Amy in her scrubs, surrounded by smiling children. She didn't have to stay after her shift, but she did. Then came the flood of stories from people David had helped. A local shop owner described how he'd gone above and beyond to catch someone who'd been vandalizing small businesses. An elderly woman shared how he checked on her house every day during a bad storm when her power was out. Each story painted a picture not of suspicious outsiders, but of two people who had woven themselves into the fabric of the community through countless acts of kindness. Mrs. Thompson, who had been quiet throughout the investigation, finally spoke up at an emergency neighborhood meeting. Her voice was soft but firm as she addressed the crowded community center. "In all my years hosting weddings at Mason Grove, I've never seen a couple more in love or more deserving of a beautiful celebration," she said. "And I've never been more disappointed in how they were treated." The room fell silent. Mrs. Wilson, who sat in the back corner, looked down at her hands. That's when something remarkable happened. People started standing up, one by one, offering to help save the wedding. The local florist volunteered to add extra flowers to make up for the delayed planning. A retired event planner offered to help reorganize everything on short notice. Even the teenagers from the high school volunteered to help clean up the garden. "We can't erase what happened," said the owner of the local coffee shop where Amy and David had first met. "But we can show them that this community is better than one person's prejudice." Security footage from neighboring houses appeared, all showing the same thing. A couple excited about their wedding, taking pictures, measuring spaces, and helping around the property. Each video contradicted Mrs. Wilson's claims more thoroughly than the last. The community's support didn't stop there. When word got out that some wedding vendors might have booked other events during the delay, 3 different local restaurants offered to help with the catering. A professional DJ who lived down the street volunteered his services. People started sending wedding cards to Mrs. Thompson's house for the couple. One evening, As Amy and David drove past Mason Grove, they found the garden lit up with hundreds of tiny solar lights. The neighbors had put them up as a surprise, transforming the space into a magical evening garden. There was a simple sign hanging from the gate: "Love lives here." Mrs. Thompson found herself busier than ever, fielding calls and emails from people wanting to help. Even those who barely knew the couple wanted to be part of making things right. It wasn't just about saving a wedding anymore. It was about showing what community really means. The neighborhood had taken a stand, not with angry protests or harsh words, but with acts of kindness and support. They had chosen to fight darkness with light, hatred with love, and suspicion with trust. And in doing so, they had transformed a potential tragedy into something beautiful, a wedding that would now mean more than anyone could have imagined. The police station wasn't usually busy on Tuesday mornings, but today was different. Mrs. Wilson sat in a hard plastic chair, clutching her purse, waiting to make her formal statement. She had spent the whole night thinking about what to say, how to explain her actions, but now that the moment had come, words felt inadequate. The officer taking her statement happened to be one of David's colleagues. He remained professional, but Mrs. Wilson could see the disappointment in his eyes as she admitted to filing the false report. She explained how she had manipulated innocent photos to make them look suspicious, how she had created problems where none existed. "I was wrong," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "I let my prejudices blind me, and I almost ruined two people's lives because of it." The consequences came swiftly but fairly. Instead of pressing charges, which they could have done, Amy and David had a different request. They asked that Mrs. Wilson attend a series of community workshops on diversity and understanding, not as a punishment, but as an opportunity for growth. The first workshop was held at the community center. Mrs. Wilson walked in expecting angry glares, but instead found herself seated next to Mr. Chen, who offered her a cup of coffee. The workshop leader wasn't some stern lecturer, but a gentle-spoken woman who shared stories of how communities grow stronger through understanding. During one session, Mrs. Wilson finally gathered the courage to share her own story. She talked about growing up with certain beliefs, about fear of change, and about the moment she realized how wrong she had been, watching Amy save her grandson's life. "I thought I was protecting my community," she said, her voice shaking. "But I was actually hurting it. The very people I suspected were the ones making our neighborhood better all along." The workshops became a turning point not just for Mrs. Wilson, but for the entire community. Other neighbors started attending voluntarily. People shared stories, asked questions they'd been afraid to ask before, and learned from each other's experiences. One afternoon, Mrs. Wilson received a surprising invitation. Amy and David asked her to meet them at the children's hospital. She found them in the pediatric ward, where Amy was checking on her grandson's follow-up care. The boy ran to hug his doctor, not knowing any of the drama that had unfolded around her. David was there too, having just finished dropping off some toys collected by the police department for the young patients. Watching them work, seeing how naturally they cared for others, Mrs. Wilson felt the last of her prejudices crumble. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she began, but Amy gently interrupted her. "This isn't about forgiveness," she said. "It's about moving forward and making things better." The most surprising moment came when the police chief himself visited Mrs. Wilson. Instead of further punishment, he offered her a position on the Community Relations Board, a group working to build better understanding between law enforcement and residents. "Sometimes," he said, "the people who learn the hardest lessons become the best teachers." The local newspaper ran a small story about the incident, but not the way everyone expected. Instead of focusing on the false accusations, they wrote about community healing, about how one neighborhood had turned a potential tragedy into an opportunity for growth. Mrs. Wilson's security cameras stayed up, but now they served a different purpose. They captured moments of community joy, children playing, neighbors helping each other with yard work, and yes, the continuing preparations for a very special wedding. The officers who had initially investigated the case stopped by Mason Grove again, this time to help set up chairs for the ceremony. They laughed about how different things had turned out from their first visit. "You know what the real plot twist is?" one officer said to David. "Your wedding is going to end up bringing this community closer together than ever before." The morning of the wedding dawned with golden sunshine streaming through the trees at Mason Grove. Mrs. Thompson was up early, directing volunteers who had arrived at sunrise to help with the final preparations. The garden had never looked more beautiful, with flowers blooming everywhere and tiny lights still twinkling from the trees. Inside the mansion, Amy stood in front of an antique mirror, her mother helping her with her veil. The room was filled with laughter and happy tears as her friends from the hospital gathered around. Several of her young patients had made her a special card, decorated with glitter and drawings of her in her doctor's coat alongside pictures of her in a wedding dress. "Dr. Amy is getting her happily ever after," one child had written in wobbly letters. In another room, David was adjusting his tie while his fellow officers teased him about being nervous. They had all shown up in their dress uniforms, creating an unexpected honor guard for their friend. The story of their wedding had touched so many people that the guest list had somehow doubled, with the whole neighborhood wanting to be part of this special day. Outside, the chairs set up in the garden were filling quickly. Mr. Chen had brought his famous homemade dumplings for the reception. The local bakery had outdone themselves with a cake decorated with flowers that matched the garden. Even the teenagers who had helped clean up the grounds were there, proud to see how their hard work had paid off. Then something unexpected happened. As the music began to play, Mrs. Wilson quietly took a seat in the back row. She hadn't been invited, hadn't expected to be, but Amy had sent her a message that morning. "The ceremony is open to everyone in the community. That includes you." The wedding itself was simple but meaningful. David waited under an arch of roses that the neighbors had helped create. When Amy walked down the aisle, everyone stood, not just out of tradition, but out of respect for what this couple had come to mean to their community. Mrs. Thompson read a poem about love and forgiveness. Mr. Chen shared a traditional blessing in both Chinese and English. The police chief spoke about how love makes communities stronger. Each element of the ceremony had been contributed by someone whose life had been touched by the couple. During the reception, which spilled from the garden into the neighborhood streets, something magical happened. People who had lived next door to each other for years, but barely spoken, were now sharing stories and laughing together. Children played tag between the tables while their parents chatted with neighbors they'd never really known before. Amy's young patients who were well enough to attend were given special places of honor, and David's fellow officers took turns dancing with them. The neighborhood teenagers had set up a photo booth with funny props, capturing moments of joy that would be shared and treasured for years to come. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over Mason Grove, Mrs. Wilson found herself approached by the newlyweds. Without a word, Amy hugged her. It was a moment of healing that needed no explanation. "Thank you for coming," David said simply. "Thank you for showing me what community really means," Mrs. Wilson replied. Later that evening, as lanterns glowed in the garden and music filled the air, Mrs. Thompson stood on her porch watching the celebration. She'd hosted hundreds of weddings at Mason Grove, but none quite like this. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a reminder of how love can transform not just two people, but an entire community. Months later, people still talked about that day. Not about the drama that had preceded it, but about how a neighborhood had come together to create something beautiful. New traditions were born: monthly community dinners in the garden, volunteer days at the hospital, and a neighborhood watch program that focused on bringing people together rather than keeping them apart. And every year, on their anniversary, Amy and David celebrate not just their love story, but the story of a community that proved that love is stronger than prejudice, and that sometimes the most beautiful endings come from the most challenging beginnings.